I'm Jennifer Kamau from International Women's Space. And I'm here today with the honor of introducing you to our guest speaker, the political activist, philosopher, academic, scholar, author, and above all, the revolutionary Angela Davis. Angela was in her 20s when she started her political activism, and since then, it has been over 50 years of fighting for radical change and justice for all. Ten years ago, we occupied this square with a protest of refugees demanding freedom of movement for all, an end to the residence obligation, the infamous residence flicht, an end to refugee camps and the right of everyone to live in houses like the rest of the population in this country, an end to deportation, and an end to the voucher system. In short, it was for a life in dignity for all. We have made achievements, but as Angela Davis keeps saying, racism remains the key problem. Just look at who is dying in the Mediterranean. They are all mostly migrants coming from the African continent in search of a better life in Europe. And they are being left to die at the sea. As if centuries of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation of this country's resources, including its people, were not enough, when migrants try to get here, they are stopped by this murderous border agency called Frontex, which uses your tax money to make pushbacks and seriously and persistently violate fundamental rights of migrants crossing the borders of Europe. We are saying very clearly, we don't cross borders, borders cross us. I also want to talk here about our feminism, which has to be intersectional and anti-racist. Or it can't be called feminism. A feminism that is made by women who have been abandoned by history. To quote Angela Davis again, women who now stand up and make their demands heard. The colonialist system, the capitalist system, and the growing fascist wave that is spreading around the world abandons us when it tries to make us invisible. When it takes our rights, we have won. But we do not give up, and we come together, as we are doing here and now. And we say, once again, when we stand up against racism, we want much more than inclusion. Inclusion is not enough. Diversity is not enough, and we don't want to be included in a racist society. We want a society free of racism. Thank you all, and I now give the mic to Angela Davis.
Good evening, everyone. It is so wonderful to see your faces here. I feel extremely grateful that I've been invited to participate in this 10th anniversary of the occupation of Orianenplatz. And this evening we uplift the refugee movement, not only here in Germany and not only in Europe, but migrant and refugee movements all over the planet. So let me thank the International Women's Space for inviting me to join you as you celebrate and as you gear up for the struggles ahead. I can tell you that I will never forget my own experience here, marching through the streets of Kreuzberg in 2015. And I will never forget how connected I felt then with the struggles that were unfolding here. The organizers reminded me that when I came in 2015, I attempted to make the point that the migrant and refugee movements that were being organized all over the world, from Germany to South Africa to Jordan to the US to Australia and many other countries, that they represent the movement, the challenge of the 21st century. And so I was attempting to argue then, as I tried to do today, that the refugee movement encapsulates our planet's struggle for a better future. And also, not only for human beings, but for all beings who inhabit this earth. When I came here in 2015, it was just before the massive women's movements all over the world, all over the world. It was just before the election of the person in the United States whose name I will not mention for fear of polluting our conversation this evening. But at that time, we were still to witness the massive mobilization of women all over the world. Women mobilized in Brazil, and especially Black women mobilized in Brazil to protest the brutal assassination of Marielle Franco. And of course, Black women went on to gain many new important political positions, including the first Black trans woman elected to state Congress in Sao Paulo, Erica Malinguino. Although we have been very disappointed by the high number of votes Bolsonaro received in the recent election, we know how much it will mean for Brazil, for South America, for all of the Americas, including the United States of America, when Lula is elected president. I mentioned the surge of progressive women, including Francia Marquez, the Black woman activist who is now the vice president of Colombia. Because I think these victories mark a new era. And because the leadership of the migrant and refugee movement here in Germany is a feminist leadership, an intersectional, anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminist leadership. And so thank you, Jennifer, and I thank Napuli, and I thank Denise and all of the other members of your collective. And all of the migrant and refugee women and non-binary people who work against racism, against misogyny, against the powerful vestiges of colonialism, and who realize that without the powerful vestiges of colonialism, and who realize that if we don't challenge the powerful vestiges of colonialism, there will be no habitable future. So let me thank the refugee and migrant movements for all of the work that you are doing. Now, I always welcome opportunities to learn from struggles that are unfolding in other parts of the world. And the refugee movement not only makes demands related to people's predicament here in Germany, but also with respect to their countries of origin. And oftentimes, the very conditions that led to their migration. If Germany and other European countries are still ensconced in a collective amnesia that relegates colonialism and the racial capitalism associated with colonialism and slavery to a bygone era that they say has nothing to do with the present. If that is the case, and I'm reflecting on the United States, the US is afflicted with a kind of provincialism that prevents so many of us from recognizing the connections with what is happening in other parts of the world today. Many of us have worked hard to reveal how important it is to support the movement for justice for Palestine. And especially the historical affinities linking the Black struggle in the US to the struggle for justice for Palestine. I mention this because I know that especially here in this country, especially in Germany, it takes a great deal of courage to publicly associate oneself with the Palestinian movement. And especially because of the false ideological equation of critiques of Israel and anti-Semitism. However, if one understands the nature of anti-Semitism, one apprehends the connections between anti-Semitism, racism, and efforts to deny Palestinians their human rights. To be consistently opposed to anti-Semitism, one has to challenge the role of the State of Israel in promoting militarism, especially the militarization of the police and its ties to structural racism. And let me tell you that having grown up in the southern states, in the state of Alabama in the United States, I became aware very early that the racist terror that claimed the lives of so many Black people, including my friends who were killed as young girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963, that terror also targeted Jewish communities. Jewish synagogues were targeted by the dynamite wielded by racists at the same time as black churches and black homes were dynamited. It is no historical accident that the first white allies of the black struggle in the South came from Jewish communities. And I am saying this because we cannot conflate states, governments, with the people who inhabit the space controlled by those states and governments. To be critical of the policies and practices of the state of Israel is no different from being critical of the policies and practices of the United States government or of the governments of Brazil, Germany, the Philippines, or South Africa. So you might ask, why am I talking about Palestine when the topic that has brought this gathering together is the refugee movement? And that is precisely why I am talking about Palestine. Half of all Palestinians are refugees, some 7 million people. And we all know that Germany cannot assuage its historical guilt by shifting the burden onto the Palestinian people who only want to be free. It is not accidental. It is not accidental that women are on the rise all over the world and have begun to give visible leadership to important struggles, including the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-racist struggles in the US. Moreover, Black women were in the leadership of the voting rights movement that evicted Trumpian fascism from the White House. Unfortunately, the official governmental leadership of the US, even though there is a Black woman, Black and Asian woman vice president, that leadership has only attempted to push back the radicalism of the movement that emerged in the aftermath of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders. The surge of radical Black women and women of color in leadership of grassroots movements against racial capitalism throughout the world is certainly an indicator of new possibilities. The fact that women, especially refugee women and Black women and women of color and Kurdish women and Iranian women and trans women this is an indication that women are inspiring and leading struggles all over the world, and this is definitely a cause for hope. And so as we mourn the death of Mahsa Amini in Iran, and of all of those who have been killed during the uprising, we celebrate the extent to which women have become increasingly visible, both in inspiring radical movements and in giving leadership to those movements. And so I say thank you to our comrades in Iran, who are not only inspiring people in their own country, and especially the Kurdish women in Iran, like Mahsa Amini, who are not only inspiring people there, thank you. The movements that have emerged during the last years within the United States, where I come from, in radical opposition to structural racism, as besieged as those movements might be today, they came forth from the recognition that even though we may be separated by hundreds of years from the periods of colonization, of colonialism and slavery, we are still living the afterlives of colonialism and slavery. We are living the afterlives of colonialism and slavery. We cannot pretend that the putative abolition of slavery magically caused all of the ways in which slavery influenced major institutions in our societies to disappear. The institution may have ceased to exist, but the racism it spawned continues to be very much alive today. And indigenous people militantly bear witness to the fact that the genocide linked to colonialism, particularly in the American hemisphere, continues to define the material and ideological place of the original inhabitants of the hemisphere. It has been assumed that because the US ranked second only to apartheid South Africa in the use of racism to define the society. And not only the southern US, but all regions across the country. That it has been assumed that these two countries were the primary localities where racism was a major and defining factor of the life of the countries. And of course, there were vibrant anti-apartheid movements all over the world, including here in Germany and throughout Europe. There were also movements that condemned US racism and expressed solidarity with US Black Americans, as well as with Latinx and Asian and indigenous Americans. From the vantage point of Germany, and Europe more broadly, racism was largely defined as external, as something which existed over there, and which could be addressed through expressions of solidarity with Black people and other people of color over there. But it certainly was not considered a problem that existed within Germany or within Europe. And I tell you, when I myself spent 2 years in Germany in the late 1960s, I could have given you many, many examples of the ways racism was expressed from my own personal experience alone, not to speak of the ways in which Gastarbeiter were treated at that time, and it continues to the present. Black people and people of color have lived in Germany for many decades and centuries. Nevertheless, like most other countries in Europe, Germany has always considered itself a white country. And I'm telling you that many, many years ago, when my sister visited Germany while she was still a high school student, an adult led her to the washroom and proceeded to ask her to wash herself. And I can assure you that her skin did not look dirty. But of course, this is the history that is always erased. And I want to share with you a very important passage from a book that was written by Harsha Walia. And the title of that book is Border and Rule. Most ironic, she writes, the migration crisis is declared a new crisis, with Western countries positioned as its victims. Even though for 4 centuries, nearly 80 million Europeans became settler colonists across the Americas and Oceania, while 4 million indentured laborers from Asia were scattered across the globe, and the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 15 million Africans. Colonialism, genocide, slavery, and indentureship are not only conveniently erased as continuities of violence in current invocations of a migration crisis, but are also the very conditions of possibility for the West's preciously guarded imperial sovereignty. So thinking historically in the present and about the present, and considering that neither the colonial nor the post-colonial are devoid of afterlives, we should realize that we cannot become so attached to the present as we experience it that we fail to understand the dynamic and dialectic production of this present. In the United States, it has become abundantly clear that we are still living the afterlives of slavery and settler colonialism. It is argued that Black people, indigenous, Latinx people are the living evidence of the impact of slavery and settler colonialism. But it may be even more important to point out that the real evidence of the damage produced by these systems consists of the structural racism that became so apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the US and throughout the world, people have been urged to think about historical forces responsible for racism and prisons and police and severe repression of immigrants. We are living the afterlives of slavery and colonialism, and easy solutions that only emphasize diversity and inclusion will not work. Diversity and inclusion without justice, without radical transformation, mean nothing at all. I have another quote I want to share with you. It's from a book published a few years ago on Dutch racism by my friend, my good friend, Gloria Wekker. And the title of that book, and I would urge all of you to read it, it's White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race. And so Gloria Wekker has this to say about the Netherlands. She says, we are a small nation, innocent. We are inherently anti-racist. Moreover, we do not have bad intentions. She's speaking in the voice of the white Dutch. And as she emphasizes, this sense of national self is generated in and by a society that, and I'm quoting here, that has managed to convince itself that nearly 400 years of colonialism have miraculously not left any traces of racism, either in culture, history, language, representations of the self and other, or in institutions. And so we see that European whiteness is neither benign nor innocent. Whiteness is never neutral. Whiteness is not a description of people, but rather a description of a structural relationship that involves the continuation of material structures and ideological assumptions rooted in colonialism and slavery. This is why Cheryl Harris, who is a Black woman legal scholar in the US, wrote an extended legal essay entitled Whiteness as Property. Whiteness as Property. Colonialism and slavery transform the planet. Read Walter Rodney's book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You know, we always talk about Africa being inherently undeveloped or underdeveloped. Walter Rodney argues that it was capitalism that underdeveloped Africa. Also read Malcolm Ferdinand from Martinique. Read his book, Decolonial Ecology, if you want to understand the long-term effects of slavery and colonialism. But let's fast forward a few hundred years, and let's think about the globalization of capitalism, especially during the decade of, let's say the decade of the 1980s. And let's think about all of the wars that have been conducted or supported by imperialist powers. In that context, when you think about classifications like migrant or refugee, we tend to think about these as inherent definitions of the person. But they don't represent individuals, they don't represent groups, they don't represent communities, they represent state-regulated relations of governance. And if you think that migrants and refugees are the cause of the crises at borders all over the world, let's see if we can recognize that as opposed to these crises emerging from migrants and refugees, they are actual crises of capitalism. They are consequences. They are consequences of crises of capitalism and of climate change. So Germany has colonial amnesia, right? And therefore, the presence of so many black people and other people of color in Germany is still understood to be an anomaly. These are people who shouldn't be here. They don't belong. Even if they are born here, they are often congratulated for their facility with the language. Wir haben sie so gut Deutsch gelernt. You understand what I mean? How long have I been speaking? What time did I start?
You can continue. You have all
Half an hour ago.
Half an hour. Okay. Yeah, I just asked how long I had been speaking. I don't want to bore you by speaking too long. Okay, well, you know, I was actually going to say something about the Haitian Revolution. Because, of course, when you study the rise of democracy, when you hear about democracy, there are 3 countries that are usually mentioned. Greece, right? And what are the other 2? France and the exactly. Greece, France, the United States. And in all 3 of those countries, whatever democracy emerged was a democracy of the minority. It was a democracy in which only white men, and not all white men, only white, affluent white men were allowed to participate. And I say, and I say this because it was the Haitian Revolution that created the world's first non-racial democracy. And the Haitian Revolution demonstrated to the world that not only could black people demand and successfully fight for their freedom, but they could conceptualize democratic processes that were not polluted by racism, that were not exclusionary. Yeah, all of the so-called democracies are defined by exclusion, the exclusion of slaves, the exclusion of poor people, the exclusion of people of color, the exclusion of women. Haiti developed the first non-racial democracy in our society, which of course is not to overlook the horrendous political problems Haiti has experienced over the years, and the horrendous poverty, which is often represented as if it were natural. It is related to the fact that the Haitians had to repay France for claiming their own bodies by freeing themselves as slaves. And so Haiti has been made to suffer all of these years because it refused to accept French hegemony. And today in France, there are raging political and academic debates about the nature and influence of racism in French society. The French government and intellectual supporters of the idea of French universalism, freedom, equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité, they argue that French citizenship and les droits du citoyen are accorded to all, regardless of racial background. In fact, they say race is irrelevant. And as a matter of fact, the French are not even allowed to keep statistics because of those statistics might be based on race and religion. Islamophobia cannot exist because of their insistence on secularity, on laïcité. But precisely the failure to recognize race and religion as constructions capable of directing violence and suffering toward communities of color and toward people perceived as Muslims. This is the source of poverty, systematic discrimination, and persistence of the taints of slavery in French society. But of course, I mean, I've spoken about Germany, I've spoken about France, and in the US, there's no reason to feel self-satisfied. But I can say that the mass uprisings in the summer of 2020, for which the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the vigilante murders of the vigilante murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and the anti-Asian terror unleashed in Georgia and in other parts of the country. But I want to say that the majority of white people in the US and some people of color still hold backward views on race and gender. And largely because these views have been ideologically encouraged. People who have no idea what critical race theory is all about are raging against critical race theory being taught in elementary schools. And if you know what critical race theory is, you know it's definitely not taught in elementary schools. You know, more law schools and at the graduate level. But anyway, they're talking about teaching anything at all about histories of racism in the US. And, you know, white supremacy is so resilient. It keeps coming back. It requires constant vigilance, constant struggle. Freedom is a constant struggle. But I think we're fortunate that struggles for Black liberation have been just as or even more resilient. And it's precisely why people throughout the world look toward Black struggles in the Americas, you know, not only the US, but I'm talking about Black struggles in Brazil, in Colombia. I'm talking about Black struggles in the Caribbean, Black struggles in Mexico and Central America. And it's not so much because of what Black people have done, but it's because of this collective struggle for Black liberation that has always been linked to indigenous and Latinx struggles and Asian and Muslim struggles. And it has been linked to the struggle to decolonize occupied Palestine. It's been linked to working class struggles. Even on behalf of those who do not recognize the connections between white workers and workers of color. But we also recognize Black freedom struggles because they have been central to the development of feminist struggles and because Black women have always been the backbone of our struggles. From Andai in Guyana to Marielle Franco in Brazil, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper. These are just some of the Black women who have played central roles in the ongoing, constant struggle for freedom. Well, you know, I call the names of these women, but I'm not so presumptuous as to add my own name. Because I know that the reason why people know my name has more to do with what people did to save my life all over the world, including here in Germany. And I'm thinking about the Million Roses for Angela, Millionen Rosen für Angela, that campaign that helped to save my life. And so I see myself as standing in for collective struggles, for mass struggles. But there is a long history, not only of Black women saving the Black community, but of Black women saving the country and Black women and women of color saving the world. And so I have a few more paragraphs left, I think. And I wanted to say that precisely because of interventions from Black women, scholar activists, and organizers, we have learned during this conjuncture that racism is not an individual defect or a flaw, a character flaw, but rather it is a structure. And some of its structural manifestations include the prison industrial complex, include policing structures. And anyone familiar with the term prison industrial complex will know that it has produced what we know as a form of mass incarceration driven by the kind of structural racism that has produced surplus populations in Black, brown, and indigenous communities in this era of global capitalism. And so because my own involvement in grassroots struggles over the decades has largely revolved around issues of police violence and particularly challenging the prison. And I want to say that struggles to abolish prisons and the police, we have to give up the possibility of reform. We've been talking about reform too long. You know, and it would seem that after a while, after you try over and over and over and over and over again to reform these institutions, and every time you achieve a reform, the institution becomes even more racist or even more repressive, that something is wrong, that we have to look for new solutions. And as I close, I want to point out that struggles to abolish prisons and the police are very much linked to struggles in support of refugee and migrant movements. And what is remarkable about all these movements is that they are being led by women from formerly colonized countries, by Black women, by women of color, by queer and trans women. And this is exactly where I began my presentation this evening. So here we are on Oranienplatz, where 10 years ago, refugee and migrant movements stood up and said, no, we will not capitulate. No, we will generate hope. We will generate hope for ourselves. We will generate hope for the planet, hope for the future, and that very challenge extends into the future when we will be confronted with the task of continuing to generate hope in order to give rise to even more hopeful futures. Thank you very much.
Before we